Chapter 15 of 20 Years at Hull House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Velwest. 20 Years at Hull House by Jane Addams. Chapter 15 The Value of Social Clubs. From the early days at Hull House, social clubs composed of English-speaking American-born young people grew apace. So eager were they for social life that no mistakes in management could drive them away. I remember one enthusiastic leader who read aloud to a club a translation of Antigone, which she had selected because she believed that the great themes of the Greek poets were best suited to young people. She came into the club one evening in time to hear the president call the restive members to order with the statement, "You might just as well keep quiet, for she is bound to finish it, and the quicker she gets to reading, the longer time we'll have for dancing." And yet the same club leader had the pleasure of lending 4 copies of the drama to 4 of the members, and one young man almost literally committed the entire play to memory. On the whole, we were much impressed by the great desire for self-improvement, for study and debate, exhibited by many of the young men. This very tendency, in fact, brought one of the most promising of our earlier clubs to an untimely end. The young men in the club, 20 in number, had grown much irritated by the frivolity of the girls during their long debates, and finally proposed that 3 of the most frivolous be expelled. Pending a final vote, the 3 culprits appealed to certain of their friends who were members of the Hull House Men's Club, between whom and the debating young men the incident became the cause of a quarrel so bitter that at length it led to a shooting. Fortunately the shot missed fire, or it may have been true that it was only intended for a scare. But at any rate, we were all thoroughly frightened by this manifestation of the hot blood which the defense of woman has so often evoked. After many efforts to bring about a reconciliation, the debating club of 20 young men and 17 young women, who either were or pretended to be sober-minded, rented a hall a mile west of Hull House, severing their connection with us because their ambitious and right-minded efforts had been unappreciated, basing this on the ground that we had not urged the expulsion of the so-called tough members of the men's club who had been involved in the difficulty. The succeeding club invited me to the first member in their new quarters that I might present to them my version of the situation and set forth the incident from the standpoint of Hull House. The discussion I had with the young people that evening has always remained with me as one of the moments of illumination which life in a settlement so often affords. In response to my position that a desire to avoid all that was tough meant to walk only in the paths of smug self-seeking and personal improvement leading straight into the pit of self-righteousness and petty achievement, and was exactly what the settlement did not stand for. They contended with much justice that ambitious young people were obliged, for their own reputation if not for their own morals, to avoid all connection with that which bordered on the tough, and that it was quite another matter for the Hull House residents who could afford a more generous judgment. It was in vain I urged that life teaches us nothing more inevitably than that right and wrong are most confusingly confounded, that the blackest wrong may be within our own motives, and that at the best, right will not dazzle us with its radiant shining, and can only be found by exerting patience and discrimination. They still maintained their wholesome bourgeois position, which I am now quite ready to admit was most reasonable. Of course, there were many disappointments connected with these clubs, when the rewards of political and commercial life easily drew the members away from the principles advocated in club meetings. One of the young men who had been a shining light in the advocacy of municipal reform deserted in the middle of a reform campaign because he had been offered a lucrative office in the city hall. Another, even after a course of lectures on business morality, worked the club itself to secure orders for custom-made clothing from samples of cloth he displayed, although the orders were filled by ready-made suits slightly refitted and delivered at double their original price. But nevertheless there was much to cheer us as we gradually became acquainted with the daily living of the vigorous young men and women who filled to overflowing all the social clubs. We have been much impressed during our 20 years by the ready adaptation of city young people to the prosperity arising from their own increased wages or from the commercial success of their families. This quick adaptability is the great gift of the city child, his one reward for the hurried changing life which he has always led. The working girl has a distinct advantage in the task of transforming her whole family into the ways and connections of the prosperous when she works downtown and becomes conversant with the manners and conditions of a cosmopolitan community. Therefore, having lived in a settlement 20 years, I see scores of young people who have successfully established themselves in life, and in my travels in the city and outside, I am constantly cheered by greetings from the rising young lawyer, the scholarly rabbi, the successful teacher, the prosperous young matron buying clothes for blooming children. "Don't you remember me? I used to belong to a Hull House club." I once asked one of these young people, a man who held a good position in a Chicago daily, what special thing Hull House had meant to him, and he promptly replied, "It was the first house I had ever been in where books and magazines just lay around as if there were plenty of them in the world. Don't you remember how much I used to read at that little round table at the back of the library?" To have people regard reading as a reasonable occupation changed the whole aspect of life to me, and I began to have confidence in what I could do. Among the young men of the social clubs, a large proportion of the Jewish ones at least, obtain the advantages of a higher education. The parents make every sacrifice to help them through the high school, after which the young men attend universities and professional schools, largely through their own efforts. From time to time they come back to us with their honors thick upon them. I remember one who returned with the prize in oratory from a contest between several Western state universities, proudly testifying that he had obtained his confidence in our Henry Clay Club. Another came back with a degree from Harvard University, saying that he had made up his mind to go there the summer I read Royce's Aspects of Modern Philosophy with a group of young men who had challenged my scathing remark that Herbert Spencer was not the only man who had ventured a solution of the riddles of the universe. Occasionally one of these learned young folk does not like to be reminded he once lived in our vicinity. But that happens rarely, and for the most part they are loyal to us in much the same spirit they are to their own families and traditions. Sometimes they go further and tell us that the standards of tastes and code of manners which Hull House has enabled them to form has made a very great difference in their perceptions and estimates of the larger world as well as their own reception there. 5 out of one club of 25 young men who held together for 11 years entered the University of Chicago, but although the rest of the club called them the intellectuals, the old friendships still held. In addition to these rising young people given to debate and dramatics, and to the members of the Public School Alumni Association which meet in our rooms, there are hundreds of others who for years have come to Hull House frankly in search of that pleasure and recreation which all young things crave and which those who have spent long hours in a factory or shop demand as a right. For these young people all sorts of pleasure clubs have been cherished, and large dancing clubs have been organized. One supreme gaiety has come to be an annual event of such importance that it is talked of from year to year. For 6 weeks before St. Patrick's Day, a small group of residents put their best powers of invention and construction into preparation for a cotillion which is like a pageant in its gaiety and vigor. The parents sit in the gallery, and the mothers appreciate more than anyone else perhaps the value of this ball to which an invitation is so highly prized. Although their standards of manners may differ wildly from the conventional, they know full well when the companionship of the young people is safe and unsullied. As an illustration of this difference in standard I may instance an early Hull House picnic, arranged by a club of young people who found at the last moment that the club director could not go, and accepted the offer of the mother of one of the club members to take charge of them. When they trooped back in the evening, tired and happy, they displayed a photograph of the group wherein each man's arm was carefully placed about a girl. No feminine waist lacked an arm save that of the proud chaperon, who sat in the middle, smiling upon all. Seeing that the photograph somewhat surprised us, the chaperon stoutly explained, "This may look queer to you, but there wasn't one thing about that picnic that wasn't nice." And her statement was a perfectly truthful one. Although more conventional customs are carefully enforced at our many parties and festivities, and while the dancing classes are as highly prized for the opportunity they afford for enforcing standards as for their ostensible aim, the residents at Hull House, in their efforts to provide opportunities for clean recreation, receive the most valued help from the experienced wisdom of the older women of the neighborhood. Bowen Hall is constantly used for dancing parties with soft drinks established in its foyer. The parties given by the Hull House clubs are by invitation, and the young people themselves carefully maintain their standard of entrance so that the most cautious mother may feel safe when her daughter goes to one of our parties. No club festivity is permitted without the presence of a director. No young man under the influence of liquor is allowed. Certain types of dancing, often innocently started, are strictly prohibited, and above all, early closing is insisted upon. This standardization of pleasure has always seemed an obligation to the residents of Hull House, but we are, I hope, saved from that priggishness which young people so heartily resent by the Mardi Gras dance and other festivities which the residents themselves arrange and successfully carry out. In spite of our belief that the standards of a ball may be almost as valuable to those without as to those within, the residents are constantly concerned for those many young people in the neighborhood who are too hedonistic to submit to the discipline of a dancing class or even to the claim of a pleasure club, but who go about in freebooter fashion to find pleasure wherever it may be cheaply on sale. Such young people, well-meaning but impatient of control, become the easy victims of the worst type of public dance halls and of even darker places whose purposes are hidden under music and dancing. We were thoroughly frightened when we learned that during the year which ended last December more than 25,000 young people under the age of 25 passed through juvenile and municipal courts of Chicago, approximately 1 out of every 80 of the entire population, or 1 out of every 52 of those under 25 years of age. One's heart aches for these young people caught by the outside glitter of city gaiety, who make such a feverish attempt to snatch it for themselves. The young people in our clubs are comparatively safe, but many instances come to the knowledge of Hull House residents which make us long for the time when the city, through more small parks, municipal gymnasium and schoolrooms open for recreation, can guard from disaster these young people who walk so carelessly on the edge of the pit. The heedless girls believed if they lived in big houses and possessed pianos and jewelry, the coveted social life would come to them. I know a Bohemian girl who surreptitiously saved her overtime wages until she had enough money to hire for a week a room with a piano in it where young men might come to call, as they could not do in her crowded, untidy home. Of course she had no way of knowing the sort of young men who quickly discover an unprotected girl. Another girl of American parentage who had come to Chicago to seek her fortune found at the end of a year that sorting shipping receipts in a dark corner of a warehouse not only failed to accumulate riches, but did not even bring the attention which her quiet country home afforded. By dint of long sacrifice she had saved $15. With 5 she bought an imitation sapphire necklace, and the balance she changed into a $10 bill. The evening her pathetic little snare was set, she walked home with one of the clerks in the establishment, told him that she had come into a fortune and was obliged to wear the heirloom necklace to ensure its safety, permitted him to see that she carried $10 in her glove for car fare, and conducted him to a handsome Prairie Avenue residence. There she gaily bade him good bye and ran up the steps, shutting herself in the vestibule from which she did not emerge until the dazzled and bewildered young man had vanished down the street. Then there is the ever recurring difficulty about dress. The insistence of the young to be gaily bedecked, to the utter consternation of the hard-working parents who are paying for a house and a lot. The Polish girl who stole $5 from her employer's till with which to buy a white dress for a church picnic was turned away from home by her indignant father, who replaced the money to save the family honor, but would harbor no thief in a household of growing children who, in spite of the sisters' revolt, continued to be dressed in dark, heavy clothes through all the hot summer. There are a multitude of working girls who for hours carry hair ribbons and jewelry in their pockets or stockings, for they can wear them only during the journey to and from work. Sometimes this desire to take pleasure, to escape into a world of congenial companionship, takes more elaborate forms and often ends disastrously. I recall a charming young girl, the oldest daughter of a respectable German family, who I first saw one spring afternoon issuing from a tall factory. She wore a blue print gown which so deepened the blue of her eyes that Wordsworth's line fairly sung itself: "The pliant harebell swinging in the breeze on some gray rock." I was grimly reminded of that moment a year later, when I heard the tale of this 17-year-old girl who had worked steadily in the same factory for 4 years before she resolved to see life. In order not to arouse her parents' suspicions, she borrowed $30 from one of those loan sharks who require no security from a pretty girl, so that she might start from her home every morning as if to go to work. For 3 weeks she spent the first part of each dearly bought day in a department store, where she lunched and unfortunately made some dubious acquaintances. In the afternoon she established herself in a theater and sat contentedly hour after hour watching the endless vaudeville until the usual time for returning home. At the end of each week she gave her parents her usual wage, but when her $30 was exhausted, it seemed unendurable that she should return to the monotony of the factory. In the light of her newly acquired experience, she had learned that possibility which the city ever holds open to the restless girl. That more such girls do not come to grief is due to those mothers who understand the insatiable demand for a good time. And if all of the mothers did understand, those pathetic statistics which show that 4/5 of all prostitutes are under 20 years of age would be marvelously changed. We are told that the will to live is aroused in each baby by his mother's irresistible desire to play with him, the physiological value of joy that a child is born, and that the high death rate in institutions is increased by the discontented babies whom no one persuades into living. Something of the same sort is necessary in that second birth at adolescence. The young people need affection and understanding, each one for himself, if they are to be induced to live in an inheritance of decorum and safety, and to understand the foundation upon which this orderly world rests. No one comprehends their needs so sympathetically as those mothers who iron the flimsy starched finery of their grown-up daughters late into the night, and who pay for a red velvet parlor set in the installment plan although the younger children may sadly need new shoes. These mothers apparently understand the sharp demand for social pleasure and do their best to respond to it, although at the same time they constantly minister to all the physical needs of an exigent family of little children. We often come to a realization of the truth of Walt Whitman's statement that one of the surest sources of wisdom is the mother of a large family. It is but natural, perhaps, that the members of the Hull House Women's Club, whose prosperity has given them some leisure and a chance to remove their own families to neighborhoods less full of temptations, should have offered their assistance in our attempt to provide recreation for these restless young people. In many instances their experience in the club itself has enabled them to perceive these needs. One day a juvenile court officer told me that a women's club member who has a large family of her own and one boy sufficiently difficult, had undertaken to care for a ward of the juvenile court who lived only a block from her house, and that she had kept him in the path of rectitude for 6 months. In reply to my congratulations upon this successful bit of reform to the club woman herself, she said that she was quite ashamed that she had not undertaken the task earlier, for she had known for years the boy's mother who scrubbed a downtown office building, leaving home every evening at 5 and returning at 11 during the very time the boy could most easily find opportunities for wrongdoing. She said that her obligation towards this boy had not occurred to her until one day when the club members were making pillowcases for the detention home of the juvenile court. It suddenly seemed perfectly obvious that her share in the salvation of wayward children was to care for this particular boy, and she had asked the juvenile court officer to commit him to her. She invited the boy to her house to supper every day, that she might know just where he was at the crucial moment of twilight, and she adroitly managed to keep him under her own roof for the evening if she did not approve of the plans he had made. She concluded with the remark that it was queer that the sight of the boy himself hadn't appealed to her, but that the suggestion had come to her in such a roundabout way. She was, of course, reflecting upon a common trait in human nature, that we much more easily see the duty at hand when we see it in relation to the social duty of which it is a part. When she knew that an effort was being made throughout all the large cities in the United States to reclaim the wayward boy, to provide him with a reasonable amusement, to give him a chance for growth and development, and when she became ready to take her share in that movement, she suddenly saw the concrete case which she had not recognized before. We are slowly learning that social advance depends quite as much upon an increase in moral sensibility as it does upon a sense of duty, and of this one can cite many illustrations. I was at one time a chairman of the Child Labor Committee in the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which sent out a schedule asking each club in the United States to report as nearly as possible all the working children under 14 living in its vicinity. A Florida club filled out the schedule with an astonishing number of Cuban children who were at work in sugar mills, and the club members registered a complaint that our committee had sent the schedule too late, for if they had realized the conditions earlier, they might have presented a bill to the legislature, which had now adjourned. Of course, the children had been working in the sugar mills for years, and had probably gone back and forth under the very eyes of the club women, but the women had never seen them, much less felt any obligation to protect them, until they joined a club, and the club joined a federation, and the federation appointed a child labor committee who sent them a schedule. With their quickened perceptions, they then saw the rescue of these familiar children in the light of a social obligation. Through some such experiences, the members of the Hull House Women's Club have obtained the power of seeing the concrete through the general, and have entered into various undertakings. Very early in its history, the club formed what was called a Social Extension Committee. Once a month, This committee gives parties to people in the neighborhood who for any reason seem forlorn and without much social pleasure. One evening they invited only Italian women, thereby crossing a distinct social gulf, for there certainly exists as great a sense of social difference between the prosperous Irish American women and the South Italian peasants as between any two sets of people in the city of Chicago. The Italian women, who were almost Eastern in their habits, all stayed at home and sent their husbands, and the Social Extension Committee entered the drawing room to find it occupied by rows of Italian working men who seemed to prefer to sit in chairs along the wall. They were quite ready to be socially extended, but plainly puzzled as to what it was all about. The evening finally developed into a very successful party, not so much because the committee were equal to it, as because the Italian men rose to the occasion. Untiring pairs of them danced the tarantella. They sang Neapolitan songs. One of them performed some of those wonderful sleight of hand tricks so often seen on the street of Naples. They explained the coral finger of St. Januarius which they wore. They politely ate the strange American refreshments, and when the evening was over, one of the committee said to me, "Do you know, I am ashamed of the way I have always talked about Dagos. They are quite like other people, only one must take a little more pains with them. I have been nagging my husband to move off M Street because they are moving in, but I am going to try staying a while and see if I can make a real acquaintance with some of them." To my mind at that moment the speaker had passed from the region of the uncultivated person into the possibilities of the cultivated person. The former is bounded by a narrow outlook on life, unable to overcome differences of dress and habit, and his interests are slowly contracting within a circumscribed area, while the latter constantly tends to be a more citizen of the world because of his growing understanding of all kinds of people with their varying experiences. We send our young people to Europe that they may lose their provincialism and be able to judge their fellows by a more universal test, as we send them to college that they may attain the cultural background and a larger outlook. All of these it is possible to acquire in other ways, as this member of the Women's Club has discovered for herself. The Social Extension Committee, under the leadership of an ex-president of the club, a Hull House resident with a wide acquaintance, also discover many of those lonely people of which every city contains so large a number. We are only slowly apprehending the very real danger to the individual who fails to establish some sort of general relation with the people who surround him. We are all more or less familiar with the results of isolation in rural districts. The Brontë sisters have portrayed the hideous immorality and savagery of the remote dwellers on the bleak moorlands of northern England. Miss Wilkins has written of the overdeveloped will of the solitary New Englander, but tales still wait to be told of the isolated city dweller. In addition to the lonely young men recently come to our town and the country family who have not yet made their connections, are many other people who, because of temperament or from an estimate of themselves which will not permit them to make friends with people around here, or who, because they are victim to a combination of circumstances, lead a life as lonely and untouched by the city about them as if they were in remote country districts. The very fact that it requires an effort to preserve isolation from the tenement home life which flows all around them, makes the character stiffer and harsher than mere country solitude could do. Many instances of this come to mind. The faded, ladylike hairdresser who came and went to her work for 20 years, carefully concealing her dwelling place from the other people in the shop, moving whenever they seemed too curious about it, and priding herself that no neighbor had ever stepped inside her door. And yet, when discovered through an asthma which forced her to crave friendly offices, she was most responsive and even gay in a social atmosphere. Another woman made a long effort to conceal the poverty resulting from her husband's inveterate gambling, and to secure for her children the educational advantages to which her family had always been accustomed. Her 5 children, who are now university graduates, do not realize how hard and solitary was her early married life when we first knew her, and she was beginning to regret the isolation in which her children were being reared, for she saw that their lack of early companionship would always cripple their power to make friends. She was glad to avail herself of the social resources of Hull House for them, and at last even for herself. The leader of the Social Extension Committee has also been able, through her connections with the vacant lot garden movement in Chicago, to maintain a most flourishing Friendly Club, largely composed of people who cultivate these garden plots. During the club evening, at least, they regain something of the ease of the man who is being estimated by bushels per acre of potatoes he has raised, and not by the flimsy city judgment often based upon store clothes. Their jollity and enthusiasm are unbounded, expressing itself in clog dances and rousing old songs, in sharp contrast to the overworked, worn aspect of the members. Of course, there are surprising possibilities discovered through other clubs, in one of Greek women or in the Circolo Italiano, for a social club often affords a sheltered space in which the gentler social usages may be exercised, as the more vigorous clubs afford a point of departure into larger social concerns. The experiences of the Hull House Women's Club constantly react upon the family life of the members. Their husbands come with them to the annual midwinter reception, to club concerts and entertainments. The little children come to the May party with its dancing and games, and the older children to the day in June when prizes are given to those sons and daughters of the members who present a good school record as graduates either from the 8th grade or from a high school. It seemed, therefore, but a fit recognition of their efforts when the president of the club erected a building planned especially for their needs, with their own library and a hall large enough for their various social undertakings, although of course Bowen Hall is constantly put to many other uses. It was under the leadership of this same able president that the club achieved wider purposes and took its place with the other forces for city betterment. The club had begun, as nearly all women's clubs do, upon the basis of self-improvement, although the foundations for this later development had been laid by one of their earlier presidents, who was the first probation officer of the juvenile court, and who had so shared her experiences with the club that each member felt the truth as well as the pathos of the lines inscribed in her memorial tablet erected in their club library: "As more exposed to suffering and distress, thence also more alive to tenderness." Each woman had discovered opportunities in her own experience for this same tender understanding, and under its succeeding president, Mrs. Pelham, in its determination to be of use to the needy and distressed, the club developed many philanthropic undertakings, from the humble beginnings of a linen chest kept constantly filled with clothing for sick and poor. It required, however, an adequate knowledge of adverse city conditions so productive to juvenile delinquency, and a sympathy which could enkindle itself in many others of diverse faiths and training, to arouse the club to its finest public spirit. This was done by a later president, Mrs. Bowen, who, as head of the Juvenile Protective Association, had learned that the moralized energy of a group is best fitted to cope with the complicated problems of a city. But it required an ability of unusual order to evoke a sense of social obligation from the very knowledge of adverse city conditions which the club members possessed, and to connect it with the many civic and philanthropic organizations of the city in such wise as to make it socially useful. This financial and representative connection with outside organizations is valuable to the club only as it expresses its sympathy and kindliness at the same time in concrete form. A group of members who lunch with Mrs. Bowen each week at Hull House discuss not only topics of public interest, sometimes with experts whom they have long known through their mutual undertakings, but also their own club affairs in light of this larger knowledge. Thus the value of social clubs broadens out in one's mind to an instrument of companionship through which many may be led from a sense of isolation to one of civic responsibility, even as another type of club provides recreational facilities for those who have had only meaningless excitements, or, as a third type, opens new and interesting vistas of life to those who are ambitious. The entire organization of the social life at Hull House, while it has been fostered and directed by residents and others, has been largely pushed and vitalized from within by the club members themselves. Sir Walter Besant once told me that Hull House stood, in his mind, more nearly for the ideal of the Palace of Delight than did the London People's Palace, because we had depended upon the social resources of the people using it. He begged me not to allow Hull House to become too educational. He believed it much easier to develop a polytechnic institute than a large recreational center, but he doubted whether the former was as useful. The social clubs form a basis of acquaintanceship for many people living in other parts of the city. Through friendly relations with individuals, which is perhaps the sanest method of approach, they are thus brought into contact, many of them for the first time, with the industrial and social problems challenging the moral resources of our contemporary life. During our 20 years, hundreds of these non-residents have directed clubs and classes and have increased the number of Chicago citizens who are conversant with adverse social conditions, and conscious that only by the unceasing devotion of each, according to his strength, shall the compulsions and hardships, the stupidities and cruelties of life be overcome. The number of people thus informed is constantly increasing in all our American cities, and they may in time remove the reproach of social neglect and indifference which has so long rested upon the citizens of the New World. I recall the experience of an Englishman who, not only because he was a member of the Queen's Cabinet and bore a title, but also because he was an able statesman, was entertained with great enthusiasm by the leading citizens of Chicago. At a large dinner party he asked the lady sitting next to him what our tenement house legislation was in regard to the cubic feet of air required for each occupant of a tenement bedroom. Upon disclaiming any knowledge of the subject, the inquiry was put to all the diners at the long table, all of whom showed surprise that they should be expected to possess this information. In telling me the incident afterward, the English guest said that such indifference could not have been found among the leading citizens of London, whose public spirit had been aroused to provide such housing conditions as should protect tenement dwellers at least from wanton loss of vitality and lowered industrial efficiency. When I met the same Englishman in London 5 years afterward, he immediately asked me whether Chicago citizens were still so indifferent to the conditions of the poor that they took no interest in their proper housing. I was quick with that defense which an American is obliged to use so often in Europe, that our very democracy so long presupposed that each citizen could care for himself, that we are slow to develop a sense of social obligation. He smiled at the familiar phrases and was still inclined to attribute our indifference to sheer ignorance of social conditions. The entire social development of Hull House is so unlike what I predicted 20 years ago that I venture to quote from that ancient writing as an end to this chapter. The social organism has broken down through large districts of our great city. Many of the people living there are very poor, the majority of them without leisure or energy for anything but the gain of subsistence. They live for the moment side by side, many of them without knowledge of each other, without fellowship, without local tradition or public spirit, without social organization of any kind. Practically nothing is done to remedy this. The people who might do it, who have the social tact and training, the large houses, and the traditions and customs of hospitality, live in other parts of the city. The clubhouses, libraries, galleries, and semi-public conveniences for social life are also blocks away. We find working men organized into armies of producers, because men of executive ability and business sagacity have found it to their interest thus to organize them. But these working men are not organized socially, although lodging in crowded tenement houses, they are living without a corresponding social contract. The chaos is as great as it would be were they working in huge factories without foreman or superintendent. Their ideas and resources are cramped, and the desire for higher social pleasure becomes extinct. They have no share in the traditions and social energy which make for progress. Too often their only place of meeting is a saloon, their only host a bartender. A local demagogue forms their public opinion. Men of ability and refinement, of social power and university cultivation, stay away from them. Personally, I believe the men who lose the most are those who stay away. But the paradox is here. When cultivated people do stay away from a certain portion of the population, when all social advantages are persistently withheld, it may be for years, the result itself is pointed to as a reason and is used as an argument for the continued withholding. It is constantly said that because the masses have never had social advantages, they do not want them, that they are heavy and dull, and that it will take political or philanthropic machinery to change them. This divides a city into rich and poor, into the favored, who express their sense of social obligation by gifts of money, and to the unfavored, who express it by clamoring for a share, both of them actuated by a vague sense of justice. This division of the city would be more justifiable, however, if the people who thus isolate themselves on certain streets and use their social ability for each other, gained enough thereby and added sufficient to the sum total of social progress to justify the withholding of the pleasure and results of that progress from so many people who ought to have them. But they cannot accomplish this, for the social spirit discharges itself in many forms, and no one form is adequate to its total expression. End of chapter 15. Recording by Linda Vell West.